The Trudeau government met the threshold for invoking the Emergencies Act to end last winter's truck convoy. And for more on this, we're joined by CTV's Mike LeCouture. Mike, we're just waiting on the Prime Minister to speak, but take us through some of the key findings that justified the use of the Emergencies Act.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting you referenced it there in the intro and how he did find that they met that very high threshold, but also at the same time, Justice Trudeau saying he comes to that decision with reluctance and essentially saying that it should never have gotten to this point, that the government did have to do that. There is so much in this report, well over 2,000 pages, it's hard to sort of unpack it and really distill it down to a couple of phrases, but certainly I think one of the things that we can say is not only will the Trudeau government take this and claim a victory because they believe that they were justified in doing this, but a number of other different parties will as well, including the Conservative Party, especially when you consider that Justice Trudeau had said that it didn't have to get to this point. And in fact, he did talk about Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the language that he used that further entrenched, but also, targeted a number of these protesters, and that did not help the situation. So I think that there's, unfortunately, and I'd put it this way, there's something for everyone in this report, and maybe that's fortunate for everyone around the table, but certainly talking about the policing, talking about how there were gaps in the communication, especially with police forces and especially between government and police forces, that it seemingly left the federal government with no other choice but on that date, February 14th, 2022, they had to invoke the Emergencies Act, but of course, a number of recommendations, 56 of them, for this government to really now take away, digest, and figure out what they're going to do with going forward.
What were some of the key recommendations that stuck out for you going forward out of the 56?
Yeah, I think there are two that relate to policing that I'll sort of highlight for you first. The first one is to possibly have this sort of structure, or at least the formulation of a structure where when there is this type of big event, and it says to consider a federal department or agency, a national intelligence coordination for major events that span national or cross interprovincial jurisdictions. And that is a direct reference to how this convoy started in a number of different places and was crossing a number of different provinces and jurisdictions, and the sharing of information just wasn't there. And then the other one is a department or agency that's responsible for monitoring and reporting on social media, something that we also know that the convoy grew there. It started there as well, and it certainly proliferated there.
Thank you so much for this, Mike. Let's head now to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who's speaking right now on the report on his government's use of the Emergencies Act.
To ensure transparency and accountability. During the inquiry, I welcomed the opportunity to appear and to answer the Commission's questions, as did all my colleagues. The work of the Commission and everyone involved was very important, not only to better understand what happened a year ago, but to have a roadmap going forward for any future government. Today, the Public Order Emergency Commission stated that the very high threshold to invoke the Emergencies Act was met. He found that what we experienced last year was a national emergency that threatened the security of Canadians. Our job as a government is always to keep people safe, and invoking the Emergencies Act was the necessary thing to do to remove the threat and to protect people. We've all been through a lot over these past years. Canadians have been stressed, faced real financial challenges, and lost loved ones. Many people came to Ottawa because they were hurting and wanted to be heard. In our country, everyone has the right to protest peacefully. That's a fundamental right that government will always defend. Here in Ottawa, people are used to political activity and protests on Parliament Hill. But as the Commissioner said, lawful protests descended into lawlessness, culminating in a national emergency. Streets were blockaded in our capital city for weeks, causing serious harm to families and small businesses. Aux frontières, à plusieurs endroits du pays.
Many borders every place in the country. It was a nuisance for our economy. It was threatening this public security. For example, each day at the Ambassador Bridge, it was $300 million of merchandise that transits between Windsor and Detroit. Thousands of people, families, and employees, jobs depends on the circulation of these merchandise. The fact to block that bridge was unacceptable. This barrage would put in peril the commerce with the United States, the supply chains that are essential, and the Canadian economy.
And at Coutts, in Alberta, guns were found at the blockade. There was a real risk that people promoting ideologically motivated violent extremism could act out, or that they could inspire others to act out against their fellow citizens. The situation was volatile and out of control. The Emergencies Act provided us with more tools to safely bring the illegal blockades and occupations to an end. Let's be clear. We didn't want to have to invoke the Emergencies Act. It's a measure of last resort. But the risk to personal safety, the risk to livelihoods, and equally, the risk of people losing faith in the rule of law that upholds our society and our freedoms, those risks were real. Responsible leadership required us to restore peace and order. After listening to dozens of witnesses, after studying the necessary documents, the Commission on the State of Emergency said that last year we were facing of an emergency, a national emergency, and the threshold that was very high to respect, to invoke the law on the Act on the measure of urgence was reached. These measures should never be taken lightly. From the start, our government has been confident there was a responsible decision, and we knew that there would be an investigation commission to make sure of transparency to Canadians. The report provides a comprehensive, objective account of what happened, and it also provides recommendations. Within the next year, our government will issue a comprehensive public response to the Commissioner's recommendations. We all agree we should never have gotten there. We're all agreeing that there's some lessons to get for everybody who was involved. Because of the thoughtful work of the Commission, there are lessons for everyone involved. Law enforcement agencies, all orders of government, and elected officials. We will take seriously what the Commissioner concludes and what he proposes. Responsible leadership means that we are always striving to do the very best for Canadians, in words and in deeds.
2 days ago, it was the day of the Canadian flag. 50 years ago, the flag was raised on the Parliament Hill for the first time. Every time I see our flag, I see values like openness, compassion.
2 days ago, it was Flag Day. We celebrated the fact that 58 years ago, the maple leaf was raised over Parliament Hill for the very first time. When I look at the Canadian flag, I see hope. I see people who work hard every day. I see a country that has overcome tremendous challenges. There's a reason why Canada is one of the most successful democracies in the world. It's because we work at it. It's not always easy. Actually, sometimes it can be pretty hard. But it's worth it. Here in Ottawa, this Parliament, the Senate, the Supreme Court, these are not only old buildings, they're the institutions that protect our rights and freedoms. This is something we must all continue to care for and defend. Not just governments, not just elected leaders, but all Canadians. Our democracy is the responsibility of all of us together. A healthy democracy is always going to make us stronger, especially in this moment of change and global uncertainty. So let's be there for one another. Let's listen to and respect each other, even if we don't always agree. And let's continue to build a better future for all Canadians. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Merci, Premier Ministre. We have 25 minutes for questions for media. Nous avons 25 minutes pour les questions des médias. On va commencer.
We have 25 minutes for questions.
Kevin Gallagher, à vous la parole.
Prime Minister, Kevin Gallagher, CTV National News. So in his report, Judge Rouleau said that all levels of government failed to put political partisanship aside to really cooperate on the emergency or crisis at hand. Prime Minister, what responsibility do you take for that failure?
Obviously, the Commissioner did excellent work looking at all the different factors that brought us to a place of emergency, a place where Canada had no choice but to use a rarely never used provision that was created 30 years ago. I think we all have to make sure we are reflecting on what to take away from that. I certainly know that we do better when we all work together. Through the pandemic, different orders of government worked together extremely well to keep Canadians safe. That helped Canadians. We're working together right now on healthcare. That's good for Canadians. During the Emergencies Act, there were certainly things we all could have done more to work together, and we will absolutely be reflecting on those.
For my follow-up on the freezing of financial assets, and this is maybe something that also your finance minister can answer as well. In the report, there was, though the freezing of financial assets was described as appropriate and effective, there were concerns, failures, he said, not having a delisting mechanism, for example, for those who have left the protest. That was a failure. Also, joint accounts where maybe one spouse was not involved or connected to the demonstration. So, does the government owe those people who were wrapped up and had their financial assets frozen but were not involved with the protest an apology or compensation?
Those were very important considerations that we were pleased that the government, that the Commission highlighted, but I can tell you they were part of our deliberations as well. And as you say, the Commissioner determined that those measures were appropriate and useful in this context. Absolutely, there are things to learn on how to do this better if ever a government has to face a similar situation. But we were incredibly thoughtful about how to make sure we could end this challenging situation as quickly and as safely as possible. And that's where the Commissioner coming out and saying that this was appropriate and effective is a good thing, not just for the government, but for Canadians' confidence that our institutions are able to handle difficult situations. I'm happy to turn to the Deputy Prime Minister.
Oh, and I get a stool, too. So look, when it comes to the financial measures, I think the most important thing to start with is, as the Prime Minister just said, Justice Rouleau's conclusion, which was, and I'm going to read it, it was a powerful tool to discourage participation and to incentivize protesters to leave. I am satisfied that it played a meaningful role in shrinking the footprint of the protests, and in doing so made a meaningful contribution to resolving the public order emergency. That is his broad conclusion on the economic measures. It's what we believed at the time, and I'm really glad that, having looked at this so carefully, Justice Rouleau agrees. I would also add that what was so important for us in putting in place these economic measures was our overriding objective, of course, was to end the illegal blockades and occupation. It was to do so without violence, without anyone being hurt. And the economic measures were a tool that really helped make that happen. On the specific question about unfreezing accounts, Justice Rouleau also points out a couple of things. He points out that on February 21st, an order issued, a statement from the RCMP effectively instructed that all accounts be unfrozen. Of course, when the measures were lifted on February 23rd, they were unfrozen. And he also pointed out in his own report that work was done urgently at the time and was being done between the government and law enforcement bodies and banks to ensure that there was a process in place to unfreeze the accounts. So all of that was happening. As the Prime Minister said, in the very horrible event that this ever has to happen again, for sure, there are some lessons for us. Thank you.
Next question, Ryan Tumulty.
Yeah, Prime Minister Ryan Tumulty, National Post. The Commissioner said that your government was justified in invoking the Act, but it also says that invoking the Act should have been avoided. He's quite clear on that front, and that he says it was a failure of federalism as well as a failure of policing. I'm wondering if you think that more should have been done, that you should have gotten involved earlier to avoid having to invoke the Act.
Obviously, it took failures. It took systems that weren't able to solve a situation that ideally would have been able to solve by a robust set of institutions and principles like we have in Canada, that we would need to invoke an Emergencies Act. It is unfortunate. It was undesirable. We didn't want to do it. But we'd gotten to a place where there was no other choice to keep Canadians safe, we felt, than to do this, and that's what we did. And indeed, the Commissioner found that, yes, we met that very high bar. There should be a very high bar for invoking the Emergencies Act, and we hit that. In looking at all the lessons to be learned so that we don't have to hit that high bar again, so that we can deal with situations of emergency, there are many lessons. And obviously, as a federal government, we will continue to do everything we can to work collaboratively across orders of government with partners in the provinces.
And we are just hearing Prime Minister Justin Trudeau speaking on his government's use of the Emergencies Act and the report that's come out. The threshold to make the Emergencies Act, he says, was met. That is what the Commissioner reported. And he said, Trudeau said, we didn't want to invoke the Emergencies Act. It was a last resort, and we needed to restore order and peace. And within the next year, he says he's going to have a response, his government will, on the 56 recommendations from the Commissioner.